The evening sky turned deep orange as the last rays of sunlight stretched across the airport. Travelers rushed in all directions, some racing to catch flights, others dragging their feet after long journeys. Among them walked Victoria Lynn, her posture straight despite the weight of her carry-on bag and the invisible burden of responsibility she carried. Victoria checked her watch. She had exactly 47 minutes until boarding. Just enough time to answer the most urgent emails that had flooded her inbox during her 3-hour meeting with potential investors. As the founder and CEO of Quantum Edge Technologies, she had spent the past week in Singapore convincing skeptical venture capitalists that her company's innovations in clean energy storage weren't just ambitious dreams but achievable realities. She found a quiet corner in the business lounge and opened her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she responded to her executive team's questions about the merger negotiations. The deal was nearly complete. All that remained was presenting the final terms to her board of directors tomorrow morning, just 4 hours after her plane was scheduled to land. "Ms. Lin?" A lounge attendant approached with a polite smile. "Your flight is beginning priority boarding in 15 minutes. Victoria nodded her thanks. She closed her laptop and gathered her things, mentally reviewing her presentation points. This flight wasn't a break. It was a 6-hour window to finalize her strategy and prepare for the most important meeting of the quarter. At the gate, a line had already formed. Victoria moved toward the priority lane, passport and boarding pass in hand. The gate agent glanced at her, then at her documents, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. "First class?" he asked, a hint of surprise in his voice. Victoria simply nodded, used to the reaction. Even after 15 years of building her company from a tiny startup in her garage to an international corporation with offices in 7 countries, she still encountered people who seemed shocked to see a woman, especially one who looked younger than her 42 years, in positions of power. The gate agent checked her in and directed her to the priority boarding line. Victoria took her place behind 2 older businessmen in expensive suits who were deep in conversation about golf handicaps. They didn't acknowledge her presence, which was fine by Victoria. She used the moment to check her phone one last time, before the flight. A text from her chief operating officer appeared. "Board chairman called. Wants preview of merger numbers before meeting. Told him you're in transit." Victoria typed back quickly. "Good, no previews. Everyone hears terms simultaneously. Tomorrow. That's final." She slipped her phone into her jacket pocket as the boarding announcement came over the speaker. The 2 businessmen in front of her continued talking as they moved forward, handing their boarding passes to the attendant without interrupting their conversation about pudding techniques. When Victoria stepped forward, the same flight attendants, customer service smile widened. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Lin. Right this way, please." The flight attendant, whose name tag read May, led her down the aero bridge. "We're so pleased to have you flying with us today," May said. "I'll be one of your cabin crew members in first class." Victoria thanked her and followed her onto the plane, where another flight attendant directed her to her seat. The first class cabin gleamed with polish and luxury. Wide leather seats that reclined fully into beds, large entertainment screens, and surfaces of polished wood veneer. As she settled into her window seat, Victoria noticed the flight service director watching her from the galley. He was a tall man with graying hair at his temples and the confident posture of someone who had spent decades in his position. When their eyes met briefly, he didn't offer the customary welcome smile she'd come to expect in first class. Instead, he turned away to speak with another crew member. Victoria arranged her small bag beneath the seat in front of her and took out her tablet. She had spreadsheets to review and projections to analyze before landing. As other first-class passengers boarded, mostly men in business attire, she noticed how the service director greeted each of them with a warm handshake or friendly pat on the shoulder, introducing himself as Thomas and asking if they'd like a pre-departure beverage. When he passed Victoria's seat, he merely nodded curtly before moving on. "Excuse me," Victoria called after him, her voice pleasant but firm. He turned, his expression professionally neutral. "Yes, madam?" "Could I have some water, please?" He looked her over, taking in her simple but obviously expensive navy suit and the lack of flashy jewelry. Victoria had always preferred to let her work speak for her success rather than adorning herself with obvious status symbols. "Of course," he replied after a slight pause. "One of the attendants will bring it shortly." Victoria noticed how he didn't offer her the champagne or orange juice he'd suggested to the other passengers, but she didn't comment. She'd encountered this subtle form of discrimination too many times to let it rattle her now. A few minutes later, May appeared with a glass of water, offering an apologetic smile that suggested she'd noticed the service director's behavior too. "Thank you," Victoria said. "Could you tell me how long until we take off?" "About 20 minutes, May replied. "Can I get you anything else before then? Perhaps some juice or champagne?" Victoria smiled, appreciating the young woman's attempt to provide equal service. "No, thank you, this is perfect." As the last passengers boarded and the doors closed, Victoria returned her attention to her tablet. The merger with Globe Tech would double Quantum Edge's manufacturing capacity and give them access to crucial patents they needed for their next generation of products. It was a perfect partnership on paper, but convincing her more conservative. Board members would take careful preparation. The plane began to taxi, and the safety demonstration played on the screens. Victoria half-watched while making notes about potential board member concerns. Richards would worry about debt load. Patel would question integration timelines. Goldstein would focus on regulatory hurdles. She needed solid answers for all of them. Once they reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off and the cabin crew began their service. Victoria observed as Thomas, the service director, moved through the first-class cabin chatting with the male executives as if they were old friends. He knelt beside the seat of one older man, laughing at something he said and patting his shoulder before taking his drink order. When he reached Victoria, his demeanor shifted. He stood straight, keeping his distance. "Something to drink, madam?" he asked, his tone professionally distant. "Sparkling water, please," Victoria replied. "With lime, if you have it." He nodded and moved on without the personal touch he'd shown the others. Victoria returned to her work, pushing the interaction from her mind. She had more important things to focus on than one man's subtle biases. May brought Victoria's drink a few minutes later, complete with a lime wedge and a small dish of mixed nuts that hadn't been offered to her by Thomas. "Thank you, May," Victoria said, noting the flight attendant's name from her earlier introduction. The young woman smiled. "You're welcome, Ms. Lin. Will you be dining with us tonight? We have a wonderful seared cod with ginger scallion sauce that I think you might enjoy." Victoria appreciated the thoughtful recommendation. "That sounds perfect." As May walked away, Victoria noticed Thomas watching their interaction from the galley, his expression unreadable. She turned back to her tablet, but found her concentration broken. The weight of constantly navigating these subtle barriers, the surprise at her position, the different treatment, the small exclusions, sometimes felt heavier than running her company. She thought about her journey to this moment. 15 years of pushing boundaries, of being underestimated, of proving herself repeatedly in rooms full of men who assumed she was there to take notes rather than lead the discussion. 15 years of building something remarkable while being questioned at every turn. Victoria took a sip of her sparkling water and straightened her shoulders. This was nothing new, and it certainly wouldn't stop her. Tomorrow she would present a billion-dollar merger to her board. Whether one flight attendant respected her position or not was ultimately irrelevant to her success. Still, as she watched Thomas joke warmly with a younger male executive across the aisle, she couldn't help but wonder how many other women had sat in this very seat and received the same treatment. How many had accepted it as normal, as just another small indignity in a world full of them. Victoria returned to her spreadsheets, but kept one eye on the cabin crew's interactions. She wasn't just noticing for herself anymore. She was gathering data, observing patterns. It was the same analytical approach that had helped her build her company and navigate countless difficult situations. The plane continued its journey through the darkening sky, carrying Victoria toward her destination and a confrontation that neither she nor the crew yet realized was coming, one that would change far more than just one flight service. 3 hours into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow. Victoria looked up from her tablet, blinking away the strain in her eyes. She had been so absorbed in her work that she hardly noticed the passage of time. Her notes for tomorrow's board meeting were nearly complete, each potential question anticipated with carefully crafted responses. The distinct aroma of freshly prepared food began to fill the first-class cabin. Victoria's stomach reminded her that she'd skipped lunch earlier, too focused on her final investor meeting to eat. She watched as flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, transforming each passenger's tray table into an elegant dining setting. May approached the businessman across the aisle from Victoria, laying a crisp white tablecloth with practiced precision. She arranged silver cutlery and crystal glassware before placing a small vase containing a single orchid at the corner of his table. "Mr. Reynolds, would you prefer to start with the lobster appetizer or the mushroom soup?" May asked, her voice professional but warm. The man, Reynolds, barely looked up from his newspaper. "Lobster," he replied without a thank you. May nodded pleasantly and moved away. Victoria noticed how the young flight attendant maintained her composure despite the man's curtness. It reminded Victoria of her early days pitching to investors who could barely be bothered to look at her presentation slides. Thomas, the service director, emerged from the galley pushing a cart laden with covered dishes. The rich scents of seared meat, fresh herbs, and buttery sauces grew stronger. Victoria's stomach growled softly in response. She saved her work and closed her tablet case, preparing for dinner. She watched as Thomas served each first-class passenger with elaborate attention. He described each dish with the enthusiasm of a five-star restaurant chef, recommending wine pairings and ensuring each person had everything they needed before moving to the next. The businessman who had boarded after Victoria received his meal, with a satisfied nod. "Looks excellent, as always, Thomas." "Only the best for our valued passengers, Mr. Chen," Thomas replied, his voice warm with familiarity. "I've selected the Bordeaux you enjoyed on your last flight with us. I think you'll find it pairs wonderfully with the steak." Victoria observed this interaction with interest. The man hadn't been introduced to Thomas by name during the flight, which suggested he was a regular passenger whom the service director made a point to remember. This level of personalized service was exactly what one expected in first class. What everyone in first class should receive. Thomas continued down the aisle, serving each passenger with the same attentive care. When he reached the row just before Victoria's, he leaned in to describe the day's special to a middle-aged businessman in great detail, pointing out the locally sourced ingredients and the chef's special preparation technique. Then, to Victoria's surprise, Thomas wheeled his cart directly past her row without stopping. She waited a moment, thinking perhaps he was serving in some pattern she hadn't recognized, but when he continued to the next passenger behind her, Victoria realized with growing disbelief that she had been deliberately skipped. She raised her hand slightly, the way she might in a boardroom when wanting to interject. "Excuse me," she called, her voice clear but not overly loud. Thomas turned, his expression fixed in what Victoria recognized as customer service neutral, a look that revealed nothing while maintaining the appearance of professionalism. "Yes, madam?" he asked. "I believe you missed my row," Victoria said simply. "I haven't received my meal yet." Thomas's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Ah," he said with a slight frown that suggested concern. "I'm terribly sorry, but I'm afraid we've run out of the first-class meal options." Victoria glanced around the cabin. Every other first-class passenger, all men, had been served the advertised gourmet meal. The businessman across the aisle, who had boarded well after her, was cutting into a perfectly seared steak accompanied by roasted vegetables and what appeared to be a truffle-infused sauce. "That's strange," Victoria said, keeping her voice level despite the familiar anger building beneath her calm exterior. "I was one of the first passengers to board, and I confirmed my meal choice with your colleague earlier. How is it possible that you've run out?" Thomas straightened his posture slightly, his professional smile never wavering. "These things happen occasionally due to loading errors or special meal requests. We do have some options from the business class menu if you'd prefer, or perhaps something from economy." The implied downgrade wasn't subtle. Victoria felt the eyes of nearby passengers flicking toward their interaction, then quickly away. The universal behavior of people pretending not to notice an uncomfortable situation. "I see," Victoria said, maintaining her composure. Years of being the only woman in countless boardrooms had taught her the value of staying calm when others expected emotion. "And the loading error affected only my meal? No one else in first class seems to have this problem." Thomas's smile tightened. "Perhaps Madam would prefer to speak with the captain about our catering limitations. I'm sure he can explain our procedures better than I can." The subtle threat was clear: complain and you'll be labeled as difficult. Victoria had heard similar tones throughout her career when she stood her ground. The suggestion that she needed the explanation of a male authority figure was particularly telling. "That won't be necessary," Victoria replied. "I'm quite familiar with how systems like this work. What I'd like to know is why the passenger who boarded after me received the meal I was told is unavailable." A flicker of annoyance crossed Thomas's face before his professional mask slipped back into place. "As I explained, sometimes these situations arise due to complicated—" "I'll take whatever meal is available," Victoria interrupted, not interested in his transparent excuses. "Business class will be fine." Thomas nodded stiffly. "Of course. I'll return shortly with your meal." As he walked away, Victoria noticed May watching from the galley, her expression concerned. When their eyes met, the young flight attendant gave a small apologetic smile before ducking her head and returning to her duties. Victoria sat back in her seat, processing what had just happened. It wasn't the first time she'd experienced such treatment, but it never ceased to amaze her how blatant it could be. The difference was that 15 years ago, as a young entrepreneur fighting for her first round of funding, she might have accepted such treatment in silence. Now, as the CEO of a company valued at over $2 billion, she had both the confidence and the means to address it. She pulled out her phone and opened her notes app, recording the details of the interaction while they were fresh in her mind. Names, times, specific phrases used. Victoria documented everything with the precision she applied to business dealings. This wasn't emotional, it was methodical. 10 minutes later, Thomas returned with a tray. The presentation was noticeably different from the other first-class meals. Simpler, less artfully arranged, clearly from the business class menu as he'd suggested. "Your meal, madam," he said, placing it on her table without the flourish he'd shown the other passengers. No wine recommendation, no description of the dish, just the bare minimum of service. "Thank you," Victoria said. "Could I also have a glass of water, please?" "Of course, I'll send someone with it shortly." He moved away quickly, not making eye contact. Victoria looked at the meal before her. It wasn't about the food itself, which looked perfectly adequate, but about the principle. She had paid the same premium price as every other passenger in this cabin, yet she alone had been deemed unworthy of equal service. As she began to eat, Victoria noticed May approaching with a glass of water and, surprisingly, a glass of red wine. "I thought you might enjoy this with your meal," the young flight attendant said quietly, placing both glasses on Victoria's table. "It's the Bordeaux that pairs well with the business class entree." Victoria smiled genuinely for the first time since boarding. "Thank you, May. I appreciate your thoughtfulness." May hesitated, then leaned slightly closer and spoke in a near whisper. "Ms. Lin, I want to apologize for what happened. It wasn't a loading error. We have plenty of first-class meals." Victoria wasn't surprised, but the confirmation was still valuable. "Does this happen often?" she asked, keeping her voice low. May glanced toward the galley where Thomas was occupied with another passenger. "More than it should," she admitted, "especially with certain passengers." "Women executives?" Victoria suggested. May gave a small nod. "Particularly women who—" She hesitated. "Look like me?" Victoria finished for her, another nod, almost imperceptible. "He's been reported before," May whispered, "but nothing ever changes. The management team, they're all his friends from way back. They protect each other." Before May could say more, Thomas appeared at the end of the aisle, watching them with narrowed eyes. The young flight attendant straightened immediately. Is everything to your satisfaction, madam? She asked in a normal volume, smoothly transitioning back to her professional demeanor. Yes, thank you, Victoria replied, understanding the need for discretion. As May walked away, Victoria sipped the wine she had brought, thinking carefully about what she had just learned. This wasn't an isolated incident, but a pattern of behavior, enabled by a network of protection that kept the status quo firmly in place. Victoria opened her phone again and made additional notes. Then she did something she rarely did during flights. She connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi. It was time to do some research. For the next hour, as other passengers watched movies or dozed off, Victoria Lynn investigated. She accessed the airline's customer service portal, scanning through publicly available reviews and complaints. Using her company's data analysis tools, she quickly identified patterns in the feedback that might have remained hidden to a casual observer. Multiple complaints about discriminatory service on this specific route. Several mentioning a senior crew member who matched Thomas's description, all mysteriously resolved with standard apology emails and vouchers, but no indication of actual consequences or changes. Victoria then turned her attention to the airline's service quality metrics and customer retention data, information that was available to her as the CEO of a major corporate client of the airline. The numbers told a clear story of declining service quality and increasing complaints, particularly among female business travelers. While the seatbelt sign blinked on for some mild turbulence, Victoria made 3 phone calls using the aircraft's satellite phone service. By the time the plane began its descent 2 hours later, everything was arranged. This wasn't just about a meal anymore. It was about accountability and change. Victoria closed her laptop and looked out the window at the city lights growing larger below. Thomas passed by to collect her tray, not meeting her eyes as he did so. He had no idea what awaited him when this plane landed. None of them did. The wheels of justice, like those of a Boeing 777, were already in motion. The plane descended through clouds that glowed orange and pink in the rising sun. Victoria gazed out the window, watching the city take shape below. Streets forming like veins, buildings standing tall against the morning sky, cars already moving like tiny insects along highways. Despite having barely slept during the flight, her mind was sharp, focused on what needed to be done. As the landing gear deployed with a mechanical rumble, Victoria gathered her belongings and slipped her tablet into her bag. She checked her phone one last time before airplane mode would be required again. 3 messages confirmed that everything she had arranged was in place. Thomas moved through the cabin, checking that seat backs were upright and tray tables stowed. When he reached Victoria's seat, he gave a perfunctory glance and continued without speaking. In the galley, May caught Victoria's eye and offered a small smile. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, then the roar of reversed engines as it slowed along the runway. While other passengers immediately reached for their phones, Victoria remained still, reviewing her plan. This wasn't an impulsive reaction, but a calculated response to a systemic problem. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to International Airport," the captain's voice announced over the speakers. "Local time is 7:15 a.m. and the temperature is 68 degrees. We've arrived 20 minutes ahead of schedule. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft comes to a complete stop, and the fasten seatbelt sign has been turned off." Victoria felt the familiar post-flight impatience building around her as passengers shifted in their seats, eager to stand despite the continuing taxi to the gate. She remained calm, watching Thomas and the other crew members prepare for arrival. When the seatbelt sign finally dinged off, the usual chaos ensued. Even in first class, there was an urgency to retrieve items from overhead bins and be first in line to exit. Victoria waited, allowing others to move ahead while she sent a quick text. Landed. At gate C22, Thomas stood by the exit door, offering practice smiles and thanks to departing passengers. "Thank you for flying with us. We hope to see you again soon. Have a wonderful day, sir." When Victoria approached, his smile remained fixed, but his eyes were cool. "Thank you for flying with us today, madam." Victoria paused and looked directly at him. "I'll be speaking with your management team," she said quietly, her tone conversational but firm. not to complain about a meal, but about the pattern of discriminatory service that you've been permitted to continue for far too long. Thomas's smile faltered for just an instant before he recovered. I'm sorry you feel that way, madam. Have a good day. Before Victoria could respond, May stepped forward from where she'd been assisting another passenger. Ms. Lynn, she said, her voice steady despite the nervous glance she shot toward Thomas. Thank you for flying with us. I hope the rest of your day goes better than the service we provided. The young woman pressed a folded napkin into Victoria's hand. It happened so quickly that Thomas didn't notice the exchange. Victoria slipped it into her pocket with a subtle nod of thanks to May, then walked out into the jetway. The airport was already bustling with early morning activity. Victoria moved purposefully toward the arrivals hall, checking her watch. She had 2 hours before her board meeting, enough time to set things in motion. In the main terminal, she spotted exactly what she had arranged. Near the gate stood Diane, Zhang, Quantum Edge's chief of staff, alongside 3 people in business attire, Victoria's head of legal affairs and 2 of his team members. Their presence sent a clear message. This was now a corporate matter. Good morning, Victoria, Diane said, handing her a cup of coffee. Everything is ready as requested. Victoria took a grateful sip of the hot coffee. Thank you. Any pushback? None, yet, Diane replied, falling into step beside her boss as they walked. They seemed surprised by the request for an immediate meeting, but the mention of our corporate contract got their attention quickly enough. Victoria nodded. As they moved through the terminal, she pulled the folded napkin from her pocket and opened it. Inside was a handwritten note in neat small letters. Flight log for service complaints. Reference, QR5591. Password, Skyward22. Also check routes 45, 67, 188. Not just Thomas. Management knows. My Victoria handed the note to Diane. Add this to our documentation, and make sure May is protected. I don't want her facing retaliation for helping us. Diane read the note quickly and tucked it into her portfolio. We'll take care of her. The airline's regional VP is meeting us in their executive lounge. He's bringing their head of customer experience and their legal counsel. They reached a discreet door marked Airline Executive Lounge, authorized personnel. Only. Victoria's head of legal, Raymond Powell, stepped forward with a grim expression. We've compiled all the data you requested, he said, handing her a tablet. 27 documented complaints against this particular crew in the past year alone, all filed by female executives, predominantly women of color. The airline's response has been inadequate, to say the least. Victoria scanned through the information as they were ushered through the door by a nervous-looking lounge attendant. Inside, 3 people stood as they entered, 2 men and a woman, all wearing the airline's corporate colors and forced smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Ms. Lynn, the older man said, stepping forward with his hand outstretched. I'm Philip Gaines, Regional Vice President. We understand there was an issue with your flight, and we're deeply sorry for any inconvenience. I assure you we'll make this right, perhaps with complimentary flight vouchers or an upgrade on your next journey with us. Victoria didn't take his hand. Instead, she looked directly at him and said, This isn't about vouchers or upgrades, Mr. Gaines. This is about a pattern of discriminatory behavior that your airline has not only permitted, but protected. The smiles disappeared. Philip's hand slowly lowered. Perhaps we should sit down, he suggested, gesturing to a conference table in the corner of the luxury lounge. Once seated, Victoria placed her phone in the center of the table and pressed record, a power move that instantly changed the atmosphere in the room. The airline's legal counsel, a sharp-featured woman with a tight bun, shifted uncomfortably. Ms. Lynn, I don't think recording this conversation is necessary, she began. I disagree, Victoria interrupted calmly. Transparency is exactly what's needed here. For too long, these issues have been handled behind closed doors, which has allowed them to continue. Victoria opened her tablet and turned it so all could see. During my flight, I was deliberately denied the first-class meal service that every male passenger received. When questioned, your service director claimed they had run out. a claim that was later confirmed to be false by another crew member. Philip leaned forward. While that's certainly unfortunate, I hardly think one meal service issue constitutes. This isn't about one meal, Victoria cut in, her voice level but firm. This is about 27 documented complaints against this same crew in the past year alone, all from female executives, mostly women of color. This is about an airline culture that allows discriminatory treatment to continue without consequence. She swiped through screens on her tablet, displaying graphs and data. My company books over $7 million in flights annually with your airline. We're one of your top 5 corporate clients globally. And yet, female executives from my company consistently report inferior service compared to their male counterparts. The head of customer experience, a younger man with an expensive haircut, cleared his throat. Ms. Lin, if I may, these numbers could be interpreted in many ways. Perhaps there are other factors at play rather than systemic bias, Victoria finished for him. Let me be clear. My company employs data scientists who specialize in identifying patterns. We've analyzed these complaints against overall customer feedback, controlling for variables like time of day, route, class of service, and frequency of travel. The pattern is unmistakable and statistically significant. She pulled up another screen showing a specific employee record, Thomas's service history. Your service director has received 16 complaints specifically naming him in discriminatory incidents. Every single one was dismissed after internal review. Care to explain why? Philip and his team exchanged glances. The legal counsel leaned in to whisper something to him, but Victoria continued before they could regroup. What's particularly interesting is that the same management team members signed off on dismissing these complaints each time. And when we researched those managers' backgrounds, Victoria pulled up another screen. We found that 5 of them graduated from the same flight school as your service director, and 2 worked with him at a previous airline. Quite a coincidence. The silence in the room was heavy. Through the large windows overlooking the tarmac, Victoria could see another plane landing, carrying passengers who might face the same treatment she had experienced. Ms. Lin, Philip finally said, his tone placating, if there have been misunderstandings or service failures, we deeply regret them. We can certainly look into these specific incidents, and you've had 27 opportunities to look into these incidents, Victoria replied. What my company requires now is action, not investigation. As of this moment, our contract with your airline is under review. That got their attention. The airline stood to lose millions in guaranteed business travel bookings. Philip's face paled visibly. That seems rather extreme for discriminatory treatment that you've allowed to continue despite numerous complaints? Victoria raised an eyebrow. I disagree, but I'm willing to discuss conditions under which we might maintain our business relationship. Victoria nodded to Diane, who distributed tablets to each of the airline representatives. On the screens was a document titled, Conditions for Continued Corporate Partnership. You'll find our requirements clearly outlined, Victoria explained. They include immediate action regarding the crew members involved in this pattern of behavior, a complete overhaul of your complaint review process with independent oversight, mandatory anti-bias training for all customer-facing staff, and quarterly reports on your progress with these initiatives. Philip scrolled through the document, his expression growing more concerned with each page. These demands are quite extensive. I would need to consult with our CEO and board before. Of course, Victoria said with a thin smile. You have 48 hours. After that, not only will Quantum Edge terminate our contract, but I'll also be discussing this issue with the heads of the 14 other technology companies in our industry consortium, all of whom are significant customers of your airline. She stood, gathering her belongings. My team will wait here while you make your calls. I have a board meeting to attend. As Victoria walked toward the door, she turned back to the stunned airline executives. Oh, and one more thing. The flight attendant named May, who had the courage to expose this behavior, I expect her to be commended, not punished. My legal team will be watching her employment status very carefully. With that, Victoria left the room, the confidence in her stride matching the determination in her heart. This wasn't just about one CEO being denied a meal. It was about changing a system that had protected discrimination for far too long. As she walked through the terminal toward her waiting car, Victoria's phone buzzed with a message from Diane. "They're already on the phone with their CEO. Regional VP looks terrified." Victoria smiled slightly. Sometimes the most powerful tool in fighting injustice wasn't just identifying the problem, it was having the leverage to demand change. And Victoria Lynn had spent 15 years building exactly that kind of leverage. Her driver held the car door open as she approached. "To the office, Ms. Lynn?" "Yes," she replied. "We have a board meeting to prepare for, and apparently an airline to reform." Victoria's car pulled up to the gleaming glass headquarters of Quantum Edge Technologies, just as the morning sun reached its full brightness. The building's innovative design, her design, captured and dispersed light in ways that reduced energy consumption while creating a warm, inviting workspace. It stood as a physical embodiment of her company's values: efficiency, innovation, and consideration for the future. "We've got 30 minutes before the board meeting," Victoria said to Diane, who had arrived in a separate car just behind her. "Let's use it wisely." They walked through the lobby together, employees nodding respectfully as they passed. Victoria had worked hard to create a company culture where respect was earned through actions rather than demanded through hierarchy. The security guard, the cleaning staff, the executives, all received the same genuine good morning from her. In the elevator, Diane updated her on developments. "The airline CEO called their regional VP back almost immediately after you left. Apparently he's flying in personally this afternoon." Victoria nodded, unsurprised. "They understand what's at stake. What about our board? Anyone expressing concerns about the merger?" "Nothing unusual. Henderson had some questions about integration timelines, but the presentation you prepared addresses those thoroughly." The elevator opened directly into Victoria's office suite, a practical space with glass walls that offered views of both the city and the open workspace where her team operated. No mahogany-paneled executive cave for her. Victoria believed in transparency and accessibility. Her assistant Ben greeted them with coffee and a stack of last-minute notes from department heads. "The board members are all here," he said. "They're in the main conference room having breakfast." Victoria took a moment to review the merger presentation one last time, making sure every detail was in place. The Globe Tech acquisition was a critical strategic move for Quantum Edge, one that would position them as the clear industry leader in sustainable energy storage solutions. All her focus should have been on this meeting, yet her mind kept returning to the airline incident. Not because of the personal slight, she had experienced far worse in her career, but because of what it represented: systems that protected bias, organizational cultures that valued connections over conduct, the countless women who had filed complaints only to be dismissed or placated with meaningless vouchers. "Victoria," Diane's voice broke through her thoughts. "Are you ready? It's time." Victoria closed her tablet and straightened her shoulders. "Let's do this." The board meeting went exactly as Victoria had planned. Her presentation was meticulous, addressing every potential concern before it could be raised. The financials were compelling, the integration plan practical, and the market opportunity undeniable. When she finished speaking, the room fell silent for a moment. Finally, Richard Henderson, the most conservative board member and often her toughest critic, spoke. "I've been skeptical about acquisition-based growth strategies. In the past," he admitted. "But this deal makes sense on every level. You've done exceptional work here, Victoria." The vote was unanimous. The merger would proceed, positioning Quantum Edge to revolutionize energy storage globally. Victoria should have felt nothing but triumph. Instead, as board members offered congratulations and filed out of the room, her thoughts returned to the flight and the larger issues it represented. The victory in the boardroom felt hollow if she couldn't use her position to address the systemic problems she had encountered. "You seem distracted," observed Nancy Patel, the longest-serving board member and Victoria's earliest investor. They were alone in the conference room now, the others having left for other appointments. Victoria hesitated, then decided to share the story. Nancy listened without interruption as Victoria described the flight, the research she'd conducted, and her confrontation with the airline executives. When Victoria finished, Nancy nodded slowly. 20 years ago when I was building my first company, this same sort of thing happened to me on a business trip. Different airline, same attitude. What did you do about it? Victoria asked. Nancy smiled sadly. Nothing. I couldn't. Back then, I didn't have the leverage you have now. I was fighting so hard just to be taken seriously in business meetings that fighting for equal treatment on a flight seemed secondary. She reached across the table and squeezed Victoria's hand. Times have changed, but not enough. What you're doing matters not just for you, but for every woman who boards a plane for a business trip and deserves to be treated with the same respect as her male colleagues. Victoria's phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Diane. Airline CEO has landed, requesting meeting at 2 p.m. Their legal team already reviewing our conditions. Victoria showed the message to Nancy, who nodded approvingly. Give them hell, she said with a grin. At precisely 2 p.m., Victoria walked into the company's main conference room. The airline's delegation was already seated, a larger group than the morning meeting. At the head of their side sat Martin Wilson, the airline's CEO, a man whose biography Victoria had reviewed during her flight research. He had been with the company for 25 years, rising through operations management before taking the top job 7 years ago. Victoria's team took their places on the opposite side. Diane, Raymond from legal, and Alex Torres, her VP of corporate responsibility. Victoria had specifically requested Alex's presence. This wasn't just a legal matter, but an ethical one. Ms. Lin, Martin began, standing to offer his hand. Thank you for making time to meet with us. I want to personally apologize for your experience on our flight. Victoria shook his hand firmly. Thank you, Mr. Wilson, but as I explained to your team this morning, this isn't about one incident or one apology. It's about a pattern of behavior that your airline has allowed to continue. Martin nodded gravely. I understand, and I agree. After reviewing the information your team provided, it's clear that we have a systemic problem that requires immediate attention. This wasn't the resistance Victoria had expected. She studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity, but found none. We've carefully considered the conditions your team presented, Martin continued. I'd like to discuss how we can not only meet them but exceed them. He gestured to a woman beside him. This is Amanda Rivera, our newly appointed Chief of Customer Experience. Her first task will be to completely overhaul our complaint review process with special attention to discrimination concerns. Amanda leaned forward. Ms. Lin, I've spent the last few hours reviewing the complaints your team identified. The pattern is undeniable and deeply troubling. I've already initiated an independent audit of all similar complaints from the past 3 years. Victoria listened as Martin outlined their response to each condition she had presented that morning. The service director, Thomas, had been suspended pending investigation. The management team that had repeatedly dismissed complaints was being reassigned. New training protocols were being developed. Independent oversight was being established. These are good first steps, Victoria acknowledged when they finished. But implementation and follow-through are what matter. How do I know these won't just be empty promises? Martin slid a document across the table. This is an amendment to our corporate contract with Quantum Edge. It formally commits us to these changes with clear timelines and measurable outcomes. If we fail to meet them, the contract includes substantial penalties. Victoria skimmed the document, then passed it to Raymond for closer review. And what about May, the flight attendant who provided evidence of this pattern? We've spoken with her, Martin said. She's been incredibly helpful in identifying specific problematic practices. We've offered her a position on Amanda's team to help implement the changes. Her insights will be invaluable. For the next hour, they hammered out details of the agreement. Victoria was impressed by Martin's apparent sincerity, but remained cautiously optimistic. Corporations often made grand promises when their profits were threatened, only to revert to old behaviors once the pressure eased. There's one more thing. Victoria said as the meeting wound down. I want quarterly reports on your progress, and I want them shared with other companies in our industry consortium. Martin hesitated. That would mean publicly acknowledging these issues. Yes, Victoria confirmed. Transparency is essential for real change. If you're truly committed to fixing these problems, you shouldn't fear sharing your progress and your challenges with others. After a brief consultation with his team, Martin agreed. They would provide quarterly reports not just to Quantum Edge but to all major corporate clients. It was a significant concession, one that would keep the airline accountable far beyond this single confrontation. As the meeting concluded and hands were shaken, Victoria felt a sense of cautious accomplishment. This was how change happened, not through social media outrage that flared briefly and died away, but through persistent, methodical pressure applied at points of leverage. Back in her office, Victoria gazed out at the city skyline, thinking about all the women like her who had filed complaints that went nowhere, who had been gaslit about their experiences, who had been told their perception of discrimination was just a misunderstanding. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Thank you for what you did. Change is already happening. Crew briefing this morning focused on bias awareness for first time ever. Victoria smiled. Sometimes the greatest victories weren't the ones announced in press releases or celebrated in board meetings. Sometimes they were the quiet shifts in daily practices that made spaces more equal for everyone. Her intercom chimed. Ms. Lin, Ben's voice announced, the Globe Tech CEO is on line 1 to discuss next steps for the merger. Victoria turned from the window. The business of running her company continued, but she had set something important in motion today. And while the airline would need continuous monitoring to ensure they fulfilled their promises, she had created a mechanism for that accountability. Put him through, she said, picking up the phone and turning her attention to the next challenge. This was the reality of leadership, moving between battles large and small, using power not just to benefit herself but to create more just systems for others. As she discussed integration timelines with her new business partner, Victoria made a mental note to check the airline's first quarterly report personally. Some fights were too important to delegate. 3 months had passed since Victoria's confrontation with the airline executives. The summer heat had given way to crisp autumn air, and the trees outside Quantum Edge's headquarters had turned brilliant, shades of red and gold. Victoria stood by her office window, watching employees cross the campus below, many wearing company jackets against the morning chill. On her desk sat the airline's first quarterly report, a comprehensive document detailing the changes implemented since their agreement. Victoria had already reviewed it twice, making notes in the margins and highlighting sections that required follow-up questions. A knock at her door pulled her attention from the window. Diane entered, carrying 2 coffee cups and her ever-present tablet. The executive team is ready whenever you are, she said, handing Victoria one of the coffees. Everyone's curious about the airline report. Victoria smiled. They should be. It's actually quite impressive. Together they walked to the conference room where Quantum Edge's executive leadership team waited. These monthly strategy meetings, typically focused on product development, market expansion, and competitive analysis. Today, however, Victoria had added a special item to the agenda. Good morning, Victoria greeted the room as she took her seat. 8 faces looked back at her, 4 women and 4 men representing diverse backgrounds and experiences. This balance hadn't happened by accident. Victoria had deliberately built a leadership team that brought different perspectives to the table. Before we dive into our regular agenda, I want to share the results of the airline's first quarterly report. Victoria began. As you know, 3 months ago, I experienced discriminatory treatment on a flight that led to a broader investigation into the airline's practices. What we uncovered was a pattern of bias, particularly against female executives and women of color. She distributed copies of the report summary she had prepared. Rather than simply taking our business elsewhere, we chose to use our position as a major corporate client to push for meaningful change. This report shows what has happened since then. Victoria outlined the key findings. The service director, Thomas, had been terminated after a thorough investigation confirmed multiple incidents of discriminatory behavior. 5 members of the management team who had systematically dismissed complaints were reassigned to non-customer-facing roles. All flight crews had completed mandatory bias training, with ongoing refresher courses scheduled quarterly. Most significantly, Victoria continued, they've completely overhauled their complaint review process. Every discrimination complaint now goes through independent evaluation, with regular audits to identify patterns or problematic employees. Alex Torres, VP of Corporate Responsibility, leaned forward. This is exactly the kind of corporate impact we should be having, using our economic leverage to create positive change in other organizations. Victoria nodded. The numbers are promising. Customer satisfaction scores among female business travelers have increased by 12%. Complaint resolution ratings are up by 23%. And May, the flight attendant who helped expose the pattern, has been promoted to assist in implementing these changes company-wide. What about their other corporate clients? Asked Hiro Tanaka, the chief technology officer. Has this affected how they deal with other companies? That's perhaps the most encouraging development, Victoria replied. The airline has extended these new policies and procedures across their entire operation, not just on routes they fly for us. And they've been surprisingly transparent about the whole process, sharing their challenges and solutions with their entire corporate client base. The discussion continued for another 20 minutes, with team members asking questions and suggesting ways to apply similar accountability measures to Quantum Edge's other corporate partners. Victoria was pleased by their enthusiasm, but also mindful of the day's regular agenda. We'll revisit this when the next quarterly report comes in, she said, transitioning to their standard business matters. For now, let's turn to our product roadmap for next quarter. After the meeting concluded, Victoria returned to her office to find a visitor waiting. Nancy Patel, the board member who had shared her own experience with travel discrimination. I hope you don't mind the surprise visit, Nancy said, rising from the guest chair. I was in the building for the Innovation Lab tour and thought I'd stop by. Always good to see you, Victoria said warmly. How was the lab tour? Impressive. As always, your R&D team is doing remarkable work. Nancy paused, then added, but I actually came by to ask about something else. I hear the airline sent their first report? Victoria nodded and handed her a copy of the summary. Nancy read it, carefully, her expression growing more pleased with each page. You know, Nancy said when she finished reading, I've been thinking a lot about what you did. Not just confronting the airline, but creating a mechanism for ongoing accountability. It seemed like the most practical approach, Victoria replied. It was brilliant, Nancy corrected her. And it got me thinking about all the other places where this kind of approach could make a difference. Nancy explained that she had begun discussions with other female board members and executives across various industries. They were developing a framework for corporate clients to use their economic leverage to address discrimination in their business relationships. We're calling it the Accountability Partnership Initiative, Nancy explained. Companies commit to including anti-discrimination standards and reporting requirements in their contracts with vendors and partners. It creates financial incentives for good behavior and consequences for bad behavior. Victoria was intrigued. How many companies have expressed interest? 17 so far, including 3 Fortune 100 corporations. But we need a compelling case study to show it works. Nancy looked at Victoria meaningfully. Your airline situation would be perfect. Victoria considered the request. Making the story public would bring media attention that she typically avoided. She had always preferred to let her work speak for itself rather than seeking the spotlight. But this was different. This was about creating change on a larger scale. I'll need to think about it, Victoria said honestly. But I'm open to the idea if it helps move the initiative forward. After Nancy left, Victoria found herself returning to the window, gazing out at the campus below. Her phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from May. First all-female crew flight today. Pilot, co-pilot, and entire cabin crew. Small step, but it matters. Thank you for making it possible. The message included a photo of a smiling group of women in airline uniforms standing in front of an aircraft. Their pride was evident in their posture and expressions. Professionals finally being recognized for their capabilities, rather than being held back by bias. Victoria smiled at the image. This was why the public case study mattered. Not for her, recognition, but for the ripple effects that could spread through industries far beyond her direct influence. She typed a reply to May. "Congratulations to you and the crew. This is your victory. You had the courage to speak up when it mattered." May responded almost immediately. "You had the power to make them listen. Sometimes that's what it takes." Victoria pondered those words as she prepared for her next meeting. Power and courage. Both were necessary for change. One without the other often led to frustration and stagnation. 2 weeks later, Victoria stood at a podium in a hotel conference room filled with business leaders from across the country. The Accountability Partnership Initiative was launching officially, with 25 founding companies committed to using their economic leverage to fight discrimination in their business ecosystems. The story I'm about to share isn't about a meal on an airplane, Victoria began, looking out at the attentive faces. It's about systems that protect bias and the responsibility of those with power to challenge those systems. She told the story simply, not as a personal grievance, but as a case study in effective corporate activism. She described the pattern of discrimination, the investigation process, the leverage points, and most importantly, the measurable results that had followed. "The lesson here isn't that one CEO had a bad experience and demanded changes," Victoria continued. "It's that systematic problems require systematic solutions. Individual complaints, no matter how valid, often vanish into corporate black holes. But when we attach real consequences to inaction, when we make addressing discrimination a condition of doing business, suddenly the impossible becomes achievable." After her presentation, business leaders lined up to ask questions and share their own experiences. Many had stories similar to Victoria's but had never considered using their corporate purchasing power as leverage for change. A woman in her early 30s approached Victoria as the event wound down. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. "I'm the new VP of Procurement at Innosys, and after hearing your talk, I'm going back to rewrite our vendor contracts to include accountability measures." Throughout the evening, Victoria heard similar comments from attendees. Each represented potential ripple effects that could touch thousands of employees and customers. The scope of impact was far greater than she had initially imagined when confronting the airline executives that morning 3 months ago. Later that night, back in her hotel room, Victoria received an email from Martin Wilson, the airline's CEO. The subject line read, "You might want to see this." The email contained a press release announcing the airline's new executive leadership team, the most diverse in the company's history. 5 of the 11 positions were now held by women, including the new chief operating officer, a woman who had started her career as a flight attendant 30 years earlier. The final paragraph mentioned that the company was extending its anti-bias initiative beyond customer service to all aspects of operations, from hiring to promotion to vendor selection. Victoria smiled as she closed her laptop. This was how real change happened. Not through grand declarations or one-time actions, but through persistent pressure and systematic accountability. The meal she'd been denied months ago seemed insignificant now compared to the changes it had catalyzed. Her phone buzzed with a message from Diane. "Just saw the airline's announcement. Pretty impressive ripple effect from one denied meal." Victoria typed her reply. It was never about the meal. It was about what it represented. And that was the truth. The incident had simply exposed what had been there all along, a system that needed changing and the leverage to make that change happen. Victoria had simply refused to let the moment pass without taking action. As she prepared for bed, Victoria thought about all the women who would board planes tomorrow and receive the respect they deserved, not because anyone feared their power, but because systems had been changed to make that the new normal. That was the real victory. Not revenge or personal vindication, but a world that worked slightly better for everyone.